Mo- Good morning. On behalf of the Department of History, University of Delhi, I welcome you all to today's session on the themes the state, society, and law in colonial and post-colonial India. The rules for the session are as follows. Each speaker shall get 20 minutes to make their presentation. At the 15th minute, the chair shall indicate to the speaker that they need to wrap their papers up. The speakers are requested to have their cameras on if there are no logistical problems pertaining to the same. I now hand over the meeting to Dr. Varna Balachandran, who shall chair the session. Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, you aren't audible.
No, ma'am. Ma'am, you're not audible.
Ma'am, you can check your audio options once maybe it is you are using laptop speaker and it's connected with headset.
We can perhaps begin with Lalit's paper by the time hopefully Aparna's device will be ready. So maybe Lalit can be invited to start speaking.
Yes, sir. So we have our first speaker, Lalit Prasad. His title is Reconsidering Colonial Defense, Recurrence of Famines in India, 1800 to 1900. I request Lalit to please start. Lalit,
You're on mute. Now? Okay,
Yes,
so
you're
good morning.
Yes,
So, my paper actually deals with the various trends in history writing, specifically focuses on the revisionist writing. Okay, so I just took that thread of famine, okay, and uh, try to deal with these trends specifically in famines. Okay, so I start with
Hello.
hello.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So, as per the available sources, okay, so
Present? Yeah.
Sorry, Lalit, my apologies.
okay.
Yeah. I'm not using my computer. My computer just broke down, so I'm using a friend. So I knew something would go wrong. So yeah, please continue.
Okay, ma'am. So, as per the available sources, more famines recurred in the 18th century, or specifically in second half of 19th century. Okay, so in first half of 19th century, uh, they started to recurring. Okay, in 1801. Okay, and my research in PhD deals with northern India, and specifically Agra division. So largely, I uh, deals with specifically primary sources from that area, northern area, northern part of India. Okay. But generally, I'm trying to take famine in general. Okay, so this is just a specification. So more famines recurred in the 19th century in comparison to any other century in Indian history. So, an imperialist administrators and scholars blamed the ecological conditions as the major cause of the recurrences. Since the late 19th century, famine have attracted much attention from the nationalists and specifically people like Ramesh Chandra Dutt and Dadabhai Nauroji and some others. Okay, so they rejected earlier causes proposed by or propagated by colonial administrators, colonial scholars. Okay, uh, so this is just the beginning of writing or taking serious that famine issue. Okay, that started in 19th century, later part of 19th century. But that proposition also that famine caused by the colonial rule, okay, got under attack uh, in some revisionist writing. Okay, and one major revisionist writing in this regard is uh, scholar Michel McAlpin. Okay, so Michel McAlpin and a bit of Tirthankar also deal with that. Okay, and Mikhail Mann. Okay, so I specifically focus Michel McAlpin and Tirthankar Roy. Okay, so first proposition that proposed by colonial administrators and some scholars. Okay, and that got under attack by the nationalist leader in the later decades of 19th century and early 20th century. Okay, and that nationalist position also, okay, was rejected by some revisionist scholars. Okay, so I come to first part. Colonial administrator thus made claim that Indians have no sense of history. Okay, so because Indians have no sense of history, that's why uh, in earlier time or in previous time also famines were there, but because they had no sense of history, that's why they couldn't record that. Okay, so uh, a proper documentation be started here. That's why uh, much more sources are available related to famines. Okay, so some instance I would like to quote. Theodore Morrison, in his book The Economic Transition in India, uh, made same sort of claim. Okay, in his own words, it is sometimes asserted that famine in the past were less severe and less frequent than in the present. Okay, such an assertion proceeds from sheer ignorance. There is not a little historical evidence to support it. Famines are recorded from the very dawn of the Indian history. If we hear but little of famine in India for the thousands of the Christian era, that is because we know very little of the Indian in those days. Okay, so Theodore Morrison is not only one scholar in this regard. Very thus there is a series. Okay, so many administrators also just made the same way. Okay, so uh, Sanjay Sharma's book also just in the very first chapter. Okay, try to show just same mentality, that how they showing that Indians have no sense of history. Okay, okay. So now on the second part of the theme, that first and second half, how they were actually propagating, that the major causes behind the famines were ecological, okay, ecological or drought. Okay, so many reports from the collectors, okay, from that district name in northern India, uh, Muradabad, uh, Bareilly, Agra, many Gorakhpur, Kanpur, many collectors actually reported in the same way that here famine recurred because of that drought or rain, just rain failure, something like that. So their only theme was, the major cause of famine was just that rain failure. Okay, that was drought, and further intensification resulted as the famine. So one very good example was there. Okay, I forget somewhere in my paper. Sorry. Okay, so but still in the first half of 19th century, less famines occurred. Okay, around 7 major famines as per the calculation of William Digby. Okay, so when that authority changed, okay, from that company rule to that crown rule started. Okay, so that was the intensification in a way of famine recurring in India. So many contemporary scholars, okay, or sorry, contemporary that administrators reported about this famine, but in the same way. Okay, that famine recurred because of that rain failure or crop failure. Okay, uh, but systematic study actually was done by Girdlestone, okay, or B. Smith. Okay, so it was just in this section actually I'm just trying to say that in the whole British account, okay, largely famine. Sorry. Okay, famine just recurred because of that that rain failure, okay, or crop failure. Very scarce of evidences uh, we can find that are talking that actually talks about that there are some other reasons also, okay, but largely we can categorize that their just major focus uh, as the causation was that rain failure. Okay, so systematically uh, first proposition, okay, okay, got under attack in the that in the later decade of 19th century or later decades of 19th century by nationalist leader Dadabhai Nauroji and specifically Ramesh Chandra Dutt. Okay, just rejected that thesis and systematically shows that famine recurred because of the colonial rule, or that or more specifically because of that high revenue rate. Okay, high land revenue rate. Okay, and that's by supported by many other scholars also, many other contemporary scholars, even some Britishers also. For example, William Digby. William Digby severely criticized that British uh, uh, business here. Okay, and he also uh, proposed in the same way, in the way nationalist leaders or nationalist scholars are proposing. Okay, for Duck's position, I would like to say some. Okay, so the most predisposing factor were economic exploitation and economic differentiation, which were forced under colonial rule. Okay, so that actually the centered colonial rule or colonial exploitation in the recurrence of famine. Okay, and uh, that nationalist thesis, or in a way some Marxists also supported the same, because uh, that famine, okay, or some other theme related to the colonial rule are the some themes on which nationalists and Marxists share the same chair. Okay, so that developed in the I think in, the scholar name uh, S.J. Patel, Surendra J. Patel. So who proposed uh, that the whole process of proletarianization uh, uh, happened in India just due to the that colonial rule. So that colonial rule dispossessed the larger mass and they become proletariat. Okay, in the early decades of 20th century. Okay, but that process started by the mid 19th century, or uh, largely 1860s. Okay, when colonial rule started, the construction of that the construction of canal, railway. Okay, and much before uh, the systematization of land. Okay, so through the land settlements, so land revenue policy first, second, that railway, canal. Okay, so railway and canal actually were just the facilitator of the same that land revenue policy. Okay, so they could acquire the uh, revenue in cash. Okay, so that's why they facilitate the things. Okay, so nationalist thesis, okay, developed, and this also attacked by, or rejected by some revisionist scholars in their writing. So revisionist scholars, on the basis of two, uh, I think, basic theme. Okay, so first theme, they just uh, took from colonial administrators. So ecological factors. Okay, so ecological factors, they just reinstate ecological factors uh, uh, in the colonial exploitation. Okay, that colonial whatever happened in the colonial period. Okay, specifically famines also. Okay, and that were because of that ecological factors. Okay, so ecological factor, and second, demographic factors. So they just choose two things: one ecological, and second that demographic factors. Okay, so scholar name, I think Michel McAlpin. Okay, so Michel McAlpin is one of them who systematically systematically studied that famine in western part of India, and specifically Gujarat, uh, Bombay. Okay, so her proposition is that there is no evidence that either the initial land revenue assessments or the revision of these assessments led to the impoverishment of the riots. Okay, so her argument. Okay, she further continues that railroads did not precipitate famines at the end of century. Okay, uh, another one, the severe famines at the end of 19th century were associated with the period of extraordinary dryness. Okay, so extraordinary dryness was the major cause in the happening of the great famines. Okay, which occurred 1888, 1892, 1898, and 1901. Okay, so she is saying that that severe famines at the end of 19th century were associated with a period
Lalit,
of
you have another
extraordinary dryness.
minute or so to finish. Please wrap up.
Ji?
You have another 2 minutes to finish, so just
Okay.
just
Okay, ma'am. Okay, so they just ignored all these scholars, okay, who revisionists actually ignored the essence of colonialism. So colonialism actually was exploitative, and which is very visible in the uh, uh, bird system theory. Okay, so just forget about the bird system theory. Just the process, okay, the proletarianization. Okay, so severe poverty just was very visible in the late 19th century, or even 19th century, even in 20 early decades of 20th century. Okay, so that culminated in the proletarianization of peasantry. Okay, so they ignored that part. So I am just trying to say that revisionist scholar willingly just exonerated the colonialism. Okay, through just skipping the essence part of colonialism that obviously exploitative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am, you're in mute again.
Okay, is that all right?
Yeah, ma'am.
Thanks, Lalit. And so now I'm going to call on another paper on Bobby Gautam to speak, and another paper on famines, I believe. Right? Famines in North India. Okay, Bobby, can you start, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Bobby's paper is called Proletarianization of Peasantry, Famines and Colonial Rule in Northwestern Provinces, 1850 to 1908. Right?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, all right. Yeah, you have 20 minutes.
Okay, ma'am. नॉर्थवेस्टर्न प्रोविंस में इन कॉलोनियल पीरियड में 4 अकाल पड़े हैं। मेजर जो हैं एक 1837 से 38, 60 से 61, 1868 से 69, 1896 से 97। अब जो मेरा जो टॉपिक है प्रोलेटाराइजेशन ऑफ पीजेंट्री, उसमें सबसे पहले एक थ्योरेटिकल एस्पेक्ट है जो पर्निल रोजे फर्नैंडो रोजे बताते हैं कि कैसे मर्केंटलिज्म के बाद एम्पायर में चेंजेस आए हैं। वो फिजियोक्रेट्स जिसमें दो बड़े नाम थे, मिराबियो और क्विस्ने। मिराबियो स्लेवरी को कंडेम करते हुए एक एग्रीकल्चर बेस पे ध्यान देते हैं। उनका मानना था कि एक आइडियल एम्पायर एग्रीकल्चर पे ही बेस्ड होना चाहिए, खासकर एग्रीकल्चर प्रोडक्टिविटी, जिसमें वो फ्री ट्रेड की भी बात करते हैं। क्विस्ने ने एक टर्म दिया था गवर्नमेंट इकोनॉमी क्यों, जिसमें उनका मानना था कि पावर कम्स फ्रॉम वेल्थ कम्स फ्रॉम। तो एम्पायर जैसे कि रोमन एम्पायर था, रोमन एम्पायर ने कल्टीवेशन एग्रीकल्चर पे ध्यान नहीं दिया था, वो केवल स्लेवरी पे ध्यान दिया था, और यही वजह थी कि वो एक सशक्त एम्पायर नहीं बन पाया, जिसका जो जड़ें थी वो ज्यादा नहीं हो पाई थी। तो उन्होंने उसकी प्रोडक्टिविटी पे ज्यादा ध्यान दिया था, नेचुरल रिसोर्स एंड इट्स प्रोडक्टिविटी। और ये इसी में दूसरा कंसेप्ट है द कंसेप्ट ऑफ प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी। प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी का थ्योरेटिकल बेस हम कार्ल मार्क्स और फ्रेडरिक एंगल्स के द आयरलैंड एंड आयरिश क्वेश्चन से देखते हैं, जो उन्होंने लैंडलॉर्डिज्म की बात की थी। कार्ल मार्क्स ने 30 नवंबर 1867 को एंगल्स को एक लेटर लिखा था, जिसमें उन्होंने कहा था कि ये जो 16 और 17 सेंचुरी में लैंडलॉर्डिज्म है, वो असल में एक ट्रांजिशन है, एक इंडिजीनियस नेटिव एग्रेरियन इकोनॉमी टू कैपिटलिस्ट इकोनॉमी, जिसमें उन्होंने बताया था कि खास जो स्टेट का काम है वो है लैंडलॉर्डिज्म। तो वहाँ इंग्लैंड में नेटिव बिठाए गए थे, जो कि जिनका डुअलिस्टिक नेचर था, जिनका डुअलिस्टिक नेचर था। एक तरफ से वो लैंडलॉर्ड्स थे, एग्रीकल्चर इकोनॉमी को कंट्रोल कर रहे थे, दूसरी तरफ से वो उनको एजेंट थे, कॉलोनाइजिंग कर रहे थे आयरलैंड की इकोनॉमी को। मार्क्स ने यहीं से लैंडलॉर्ड्स और टीनेज का वो दिया। और अब अगर इंडिया के सेंस में देखें, तो इंडिया के सेंस में रणजीत गुहा बताते हैं कि कैसे फिजियोक्रेसी एग्रीकल्चर में कैसे इम्प्रूवमेंट को लेके फिजियोक्रेट्स से इन्फ्लुएंस्ड होके बंगाल में प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी का कंसेप्ट आया था, जिसमें परमानेंट सेटल एक मेजर वो था, परमानेंट सेटल, जिसमें दो क्लास इमर्ज हुए थे। पहला क्लास था जमींदार और दूसरा था पीजेंट्री, और जो कि टीनेट्स बन गया था। अब इसी में एक मेजर पॉइंट है कि क्या सोसाइटी में कोई जो सोसाइटी की जो सबसे निचली परत थी, खासकर जो लोअर कास्ट कम्युनिटी, उसमें क्या बदलाव आए थे। तो उसमें मेडिसन अपनी किताब में लिखते हैं, मेडिसन अपनी किताब क्लास स्ट्रक्चर एंड द इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ इंडिया एंड पाकिस्तान सिंस द मुगल, मेडिसन रोटली 2006 पेज नंबर 46 पे लिखते हैं कि ये जो चेंजेस आए थे खासकर प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी के थ्रू, उसमें सोसाइटी का जो सबसे निचली परत है उसमें कोई बदलाव नहीं आ रहा है, क्योंकि जो अंग्रेज हैं वो जमींदारों तक ही सीमित है, और वो जो मेजोरिटी थी वो अपर कास्ट ही थी, और जो लैंडलेस पीजेंट्री थी, लैंडलेस और प्लस पीजेंट्री थोड़ा बहुत छोटी मोटी जो था, तो वो लोअर कास्ट था। और वहीं वो एक उदाहरण देते हैं कि जैसे रैयतवाड़ी सिस्टम मद्रास और बॉम्बे, इसमें कॉलोनियल गवर्नमेंट पीजेंट्स तक गई तो थी, मगर वो पीजेंट्स तक गई थी मगर वो स्ट्रक्चर बना हुआ था। वो जमींदार वर्ग अपर कास्ट वर्ग उसको मिसलीड करके वही सिस्टम लागू कर रहा था, ना कि वो स्टेट से लोअर कास्ट जो पॉपुलेशन थी, मेजॉरिटी थी, पीजेंट्री थी, वो कभी स्टेट से डायरेक्ट इंटरेक्ट नहीं कर पाई। अब प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी के बाद है क्लास फॉर्मेशन। ये लैंडलॉर्ड्स और टीनेट्स और फिर एडवेंट क्लैंड का 1937 में आर्टिकल है जिसमें उन्होंने बताया था कि जो जमींदार था वो कौन सा कास्ट फैक्टर क्या है। अब फेमिन्स एंड एग्रेरियन लेबर, जो फेमिन्स 1837-38, 1860-61, 1868 से 69, 1896 से 97, उसमें, और एग्रेरियन अब टीनेट्स बन गया था। तो टीनेट्स एक कैश पेमेंट, रेवेन्यू की बढ़ती हुई मांग, और ये 1857 की क्रांति के बाद थोड़ा बहुत कम हो गया था। उसके बाद रेवेन्यू बढ़ता ही गया था। फेमिन्स की अगर बात करें तो ज्यादातर जो कॉलोनियल फेमिन्स कमीशन है उनके जो हिस्टोरियोग्राफी है, तो 1880 की फेमिन्स रिपोर्ट में बताया गया कि जो प्री ब्रिटिश फेमिन्स थे वो पॉलिटिकल और इकोनॉमिक्स, और खासकर उसमें युद्ध वगैरह ज्यादा थे। और जो कॉलोनियल टाइम में है वो टोटली डेमोग्राफिकल है। अब अकालों में सबसे ज्यादा जो अफेक्टेड पॉपुलेशन थी वो पीजेंट्री थी। पीजेंट्री अब तो लैंडलेस क्लास बन गई थी, वो सबसे ज्यादा थी। और इसके कई उदाहरण हैं, BM भाटिया अपनी किताब में बताते हैं, और प्रोफेसर संतोष राय अपने एक आर्टिकल जिसमें ईस्टर्न यूपी का जिक्र करते हैं कि कैसे जुलाहे की जो परचेजिंग पावर खत्म होने के बाद सबसे ज्यादा अकालों में परचेजिंग पावर खत्म होने के बाद सबसे ज्यादा जो संकट था वो जुलाहों पे ही पड़ गया था। BM भाटिया एग्रेरियन लेबर। एक मिनट,
Bobby, are you able to continue? Otherwise, we go on to the next paper.
ओके मैम, मैं कंक्लूजन पे आता हूँ।
हाँ, आप कंटिन्यू कर सकते हैं क्या?
हाँ मैम, हाँ तो थोड़ा मैं एक पॉइंट देख रहा हूँ मैं।
हाँ ठीक है।
तो जो फेमांस का जो ज्यादातर जो इन्फेक्टेड क्लास थी, उसमें क्लास क्लास स्ट्रक्चर देखें तो एक फेमिन्स का स्ट्रक्चर तो कॉलोनियल टाइम में बताया गया कि ये डेमोग्राफिकल था, बट ये डेमोग्राफिकल नहीं कहा जा सकता क्योंकि इसमें जो इफेक्टेड क्लास थी वो मेजोरिटी लोअर कास्ट की ही थी, जिसका एक
Bobby, I think you should wrap up. If you're not able to finish, you can come in when you have question and answers.
Okay.
Razi, are you here? Okay.
Okay.
Do you want to say something more?
No, मैं conclusion देता हूँ 2 मिनट में बस.
ठीक है, conclusion दे दो.
जी मैम, प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी के बाद क्लास स्ट्रक्चर बनना है. क्लास स्ट्रक्चर से इंडिया में क्लास दो फॉर्म में आ रही है, एक जमींदारी क्लास और एक जमींदारी, एक लैंडलेस. जमींदारी और एक लैंडलेस, जिसे प्रोलेटेरिएट, जिसके बाद जो फेमिन्स आ रहे हैं, फेमिन्स में सबसे ज्यादा जो अफेक्टेड क्लास है एक वो लैंडलेस ही है ना, लैंडलेस, और वो जमींदारी क्लास बिल्कुल भी नहीं है बस में.
Thank you. Okay, let's have the next paper then by Annie, which is called, the paper is called The Ubiquity of Emergency Laws in India, the trial of Suresh Sanyal. Annie, do you want to start?
Yes, ma'am.
Where are you?
Am I audible? I'm here.
Yes, you're audible. Yeah. And Moksh, please keep an eye on the time, huh? And let me know. Okay. Yeah, please start.
Good afternoon. So I want to look at the everyday life of emergency law measures, particularly sedition in colonial India, and explore the ways in which sedition against the state was understood, negotiated, and articulated by colonial subjects. So Suresh Sanyal was a young school-going boy aged between 18 to 20 years, and he was accused of sedition for sending out a leaflet titled Matri Puja to the headmaster of a Zilla school in Rangpur. So I traced this case as it was produced and narrated at different levels. That includes the filing of the charges, investigation conducted by the police, the court proceedings, and the arguments forwarded both by the defense and the prosecution. I argue that a focus on legal processes rather than judgment and legislations alone will allow us to see how subjects imbued the law with meaning and that drew from their own identities and social and political locations. Let me first begin by giving you a brief about the law. So the law concerning sedition first appeared in Macaulay's draft of IPC of 1837-39. However, it was only in 1837 that section 124A, that is sedition, was incorporated in the IPC as an offense for exciting disaffection against colonial rule. The punishment for sedition went as high as life imprisonment, signaling the seriousness of the charge. The first case tried under sedition was against a weekly newspaper called Banga Basi in 1891, 21 years after the law was passed. So this newspaper had been publishing articles opposing the government in the Age of Consent Act for sexual intercourse for girls from 10 to 12 years. Following this, some other notable trials also happened, like trial against Tilak, right? And all of these cases kept reigniting the debate and meaning of sedition. These trials also made apparent to the colonial government some of the supposed loopholes that necessitated further interventions in the law. So following these cases, the Banga Basi trial or the trial of Tilak, the state again amended the law in 1897
and made clear that disaffection also included within its ambit hatred and contempt and disloyalty and all feelings of enmity for the colonial state. So with the coming in of these amendments, the case is no longer required to establish direct incitement to violence or rebellion. This and other further amendments made the parameters of this law very wide. So in case of these measures, particularly sedition in colonial India, some attention has been paid on notable cases which involve famous dissident figures like, of course, Tilak, Gandhi. And these studies have largely been framed within this larger history of anti-colonial resistance. For instance, Tilak found himself embroiled in 3 cases, in 1907 and 1908 against his articles, and in 1916 for a speech that he gave. He tried to argue that his anger was reserved for the bureaucracy rather than the government, but to no avail, as he was again convicted in all of these cases. Again, Gandhi's trial has also received some attention, and his subsequent conviction is one of the most, quoted cases where he successfully took control of the narratives and stated that it was a matter of pride for him to be charged under a crime like this. So Deepta Kaviraj makes an very interesting observation about these trials being a spectacle of power. He writes, trials bring to representation not only the material, violent, tangible aspects of political power, but also its ideal, symbolic, and representational forms. So colonial authorities use this spectacle to assert their power, but at the same time, the accused also use these cases as a theater for deterrence. Thus, even though these trials could be regarded as unequal and tilted in the favor of the state, yet the dialogical character of the trials allowed people to put forward their own arguments. Therefore, on the one hand, the amendments and judicial interventions widened the parameters of the law, increasingly allowing state intervention and encompassing wide range of anti-colonial expression as seditious. But at the same time, the accused also brought forward their own interpretation of the law and offered challenges both by responding within the state logic and by constructing their alternative narratives. However, beyond these spectacular cases which have garnered some scholarly attention, there are a large number of cases filed against relatively people. And the multiple ways in which the accused were negotiating with the law is particularly visible when we look at these less popular cases. So if in period between 1870 and 1900, only a handful of cases were prosecuted under sedition, it soon began to change from 1906 onward, which witnessed a proliferation of such cases. The increase in the number of cases can be attributed to 2 factors. One was the shift in the relationship between people and the state with the emergence of the Swadeshi movement, and 2, the widened parameters of Section 120 of 124A, allowing for easy charging and prosecution of people. So one such case that I just, I mentioned, I want to discuss is that of Suresh Chandra Sanyal. Suresh Sanyal was a school-going boy. He was aged between 18 to 20 years and was accused of sedition for sending out a leaflet titled Matri Puja to the headmaster of a Zilla school. Headmaster, on receiving this pamphlet, identified this pamphlet as seditious and dispatched it to the DM. And and it opened a whole Pandora's box. Files were passed in quick succession from one office to another. No time was wasted in filing of the complaint and investigation being started. So, and in 1912, this case happened, and detailed police inquiries were held. House searches happened, and the case was first in the district court, then it was later heard in the high court, and accused pleaded not guilty and denied writing or posting this leaflet. So I will trace these developments of this case. But before that, let me discuss the pamphlet itself, the leaflet, Matri Puja. It was quite a lengthy leaflet and included within it 6 articles. Our duties, ultimate aim, advance, and appeal, what is an enemy, and don't sleep any longer, arise. So in the article, Our Duties, the writer urges Indians to drive out Englishmen. It describes Englishmen as locusts, destroying crops, and robbers plundering wealth, and the need of Indians to put down the foreign militias. The theme of driving out English is visible in all of these articles. An Indian is necessarily described as a Hindu man. The article, for instance, advance note that only those English, and I quote, are in only those people are Indians who drive out English, and they're Hindu men, are Indians, Hindus and men. They are the sons of Hindus whose heroism once shook the earth. It is interesting to note that English are being described as militias, Ravanas, Rakshasas, and Indians expected to drive them away are being called to gather their strengths as Hindus. This period, witnessed the coming together of politics with religious revivalism, and it drew more often than not from cultural traditions. Thus, on the one hand, there is an attempt to remind Hindus of the glorious past and thereby, generating within them a sense of entitlement about their past, about their position in the country, and on the other hand, to create a sense of heightened awareness of self-deprivation and thus stirring up to act against the English to regain that past glory. Another theme visible in the text is the imagination of India as mother. Scholars have, discussed how culturalized discourse very often employ gendered bodies and sexualities as markers of territories and reproducers of the narratives of nations and other collectivities. Women are often required to carry the burden of representation as they are constructed as symbolic bearers of nation's identity and honor. A figure of woman, often mother, symbolizes in many cultures the spirit of the collectivity. This is again evident from this leaflet as well. My example from the article Our Duties. Here, the reader's attention is drawn to the 800 mother goddess, destroyer of the evil. It states that to be worthy sons of this mother, they should turn out of India the English, the cunning militias who are the suckers of mother's blood. Besides referring to gendered imageries and Hindu iconographies, the leaflet also mentions movements and struggles outside India as well. There are references to developments in Transvaal in South Africa or the nihilist movement in Russia, again indicating that the political movement in India were trying to engage with anti-imperialist developments in other parts of the world as well. Another interesting point that comes out of the leaflet is that if government through laws like sedition was trying to identify traitors of the state, a similar process was underway among the Indian public as well. People who were not actively participating in anti-colonial struggles were being deemed as traitors, as opposed to those who were making sacrifices for the country. For instance, the article Our Duties warns, and I quote, "A very terrible fate awaits traitors." Thus, this allows us to see the diametrically opposed ways in which traitor is being construed by the state and the anti-colonial collectives. So, in my reading of the leaflet, the leaflet indicates the way in which the dissent was being articulated in the vernacular public press. It was drawing from different cultural tropes available to people, be it the religion and textual traditions, or the use of gendered imageries to symbolize the collectivity, unity, honor as well. There was also an effort to position India's struggle as a part of the larger anti-imperialist movement in the world. Now, coming back to the case, the investigation and searches begin. The sub-inspector Babu Mohini Mohan Rai overtook the investigation. He, along with 8 constables, reached the accused village, father and his other relatives, and searched his house. On search, the police found several articles, a private diary, songbooks. They discovered the Matri Puja leaflet as well. There was also a wooden box, the key of which was produced by the accused himself. In it, they found Jugantar, a periodical, leaflets like Swadeshi Bharat, letters, postcard, money order receipt. And all of these articles were then taken to Pabna and laid before the Superintendent of Police. On the basis of these searches were conducted. BP Mazumdar, a CID officer in Calcutta, went to investigate, the purchases mentioned in the diary and postcard found at Suresh Sanyal's house. One of the postcard found during the search had a name of a library mentioned, that is Manmohan Library, with prices mentioned of certain publications such as Nihilist Mysteries, Sepoy Revolt, Tilak's Case. Now they went to the library and confirmed books from here, and the books were soon dispatched on receipt of the money. Then they went to this another bookshop called Gurudas Chatterjee. They checked the ledger and discovered that similar types of books like Matri Puja, Matri Bhakti, Russo Japanese War, books like these were ordered from this library by Suresh Sanyal. They then went to the office of Hitapti newspaper, again checked the ledger and confirmed that he had subscribed to these newspapers. So these inquiries were mentioned by the prosecution in the court to argue that the literature in possession of the accused was very similar to the contents in the leaflet. The judge, taking note of it in the judgment, stated, and I quote, "It is clear that the writer had been long brooding over the supposed wrong of his countrymen." This led the court to establish a link of the accused with that of the leaflet. Moreover, this detailed investigation on the kind of literature that Suresh Sanyal was reading also positioned him in the larger anti-colonial movement, which was already under close scrutiny by the colonial state. It was no longer an isolated case of individual criminality, but a part of a bigger narrative. It is also interesting to note that some of the key evidences collected and corroborated with such great effort against Suresh Sanyal were the details of the texts he read. And this appears to have been a feature of several other sedition trials as well. The second aspect of the investigation was the kind of witnesses that were brought forward. The police examined 3 classmates of Suresh Sanyal. Of the 3, only 2, Sayyid Ali Sarkar and Muhammad Mansir, appeared before the court. The 2 boys were brought forward to comment whether the writing on the pamphlets belonged to the accused. Both of them corroborated in front of the DM and at the court that the writing of that it was the writing of Suresh Sanyal. It was this proceeding, however, on the part of the prosecution that generated a very strong criticism from the defense. One defense argued that witness had been tainted. Employing precedent cases, defense argues that witnesses were under the influence of the police or that they were tortured by the police. Prosecution rejected these allegations, and the judge also seemed to agree that they weren't under the influence of police, and they were telling the truth. Another point, however, is that defense further argued that there were Hindu students in the class as well, but the prosecution did not ask them to testify on the handwriting. Further discredit the witness, the defense argued that Sayyid Ali was in a school whose headmaster was Suresh Sanyal's father, and the headmaster, that is Suresh Sanyal's father, had punished him, and he was made to kneel on a bench for non-attendance. Likewise, Mansoor was denied free studentship, and that's why he was distressed. He also stated that since one other Muslim student had been rusticated by Suresh Sanyal's father, therefore the Mussalman boys were distressed. So the attempt by the defense to suggest that because the witnesses were Muslims, they were testifying against their Hindu classmate is particularly noteworthy. This emphasizes that a trial could not be merely seen from a binary lens of colonial state versus anti-colonial struggle. It complicates the claim of nationalist universalism and sheds light on the many pulls that existed. It takes note of the way in which multiple identities continue to play a significant role in the way people were articulating their defense. The third aspect that I want to focus is...
Annie, sorry to interrupt. Just wrap up in about 2 minutes.
Okay.
2 or 3 minutes, okay?
Yes. So, the prosecution, stated that that the leaflet clearly shows that this is seditious in nature, because it tries to it reflects that the government reflects the hatred that the accused had towards the government. The defense, on the other hand, tried to argue that the articles of the leaflet were aimed at missionaries, and all the labels mentioned could not really apply to the government. The judgment, however, rejected the claim. So even though the defense's arguments were rejected, but to claim that the leaflet was intended against certain individuals, such as missionaries, to circumvent the law is noteworthy. This had been a feature of many other trials as well. For instance, Ali Jinnah during Tilak's trial tried to argue along similar lines, that Tilak's article were aimed at the bureaucracy and not the government. So the judgment, in rejecting defense's statement, stated that missionaries were not the only ones aimed at in the leaflet, implying had the defense been able to establish itself, the accused could have probably been let go. This suggests that people were attempting to circumvent the law by trying to define and redefine the category of the government itself. This reflects an attempt at the widening boundaries and the possibilities of acceptable critique by narrowing the meaning of what constitutes a government. So the term government is dissociated from bureaucracy and the missionaries, in turn forcing the court to respond to the definition set by the defense. In the trial court judgment, Suresh Sanyal was found guilty under section 124A, and he was sentenced for 2 years of rigorous imprisonment. His young age was also not considered while sentencing him, because he was found in possession of copies of Jugantar. Thus, even while sentenced, primacy was given to the reading material found on him. The case moved to the High Court. In this judgment too, seditious nature of the leaflet was well established. The defense also did not try to attempt to prove otherwise. However, defense's claim that the writing belonged to Suresh Sanyal was the one that was debated. Judges agreed that you cannot prove that the writing belonged to Suresh. The judge noted that the Mohammedan book could not have known if the handwriting was belonged to Suresh by seeing how he wrote in class. So the judgment did note that Suresh Sanyal was in possession, and I quote, of highly seditious literature, and he had habitually sent for, purchased and read such literature, is certain and may give rise to the suspicion that he was engaged in disseminating such writing among his friends and associates. However, the judge took that he had spent several months in jail, both as an under trial and as a convict, and his age was also taken into consideration. It said that he had amply been punished, and that we hope he has realized his folly and wickedness of tampering with sedition as his young age, as he is young enough to reform and become a useful member of the society, and this is sufficient warning for him. So High Court set aside the trial and acquitted Suresh Sanyal. So in the end, some of the things that come across is that this case indicates that, is indicative of the proliferation of sedition cases. If earlier only a handful of cases were tried, from 1910 onwards, ordinary people were tried under sedition as evident from the case. A young boy was charged, and the entire bureaucratic and legal structures were up in arms. 2, the leaflet indicates the way in which dissent was being articulated in the vernacular public sphere. It was drawing from different cultural tropes, religion, gender, wider anti-national, anti-imperial movement. 3, the 2 trials sufficiently established that the reading material found in Suresh Sanyal continued to determine the perception of the accused and the eventual judgment. The thorough investigation and searches carried out in 2 regions, Pabna and Calcutta, and through different agencies, local police, CID, was to detail the books and journals he was reading. So in the trial court, it remained one of the key evidences against him, even ensuring that his young age is not taken into consideration while sentencing him. Likewise, the High Court also notice of the same, and that he was tampering with sedition. Even as he was acquitted for lack of evidence, the judgment stated that he was amply punished for dabbling in sedition. For these trials cannot be seen as a site of just colonial state versus anti-colonial struggle. There were multiple identities that were at play, and they continue to shape the way in which defense was forwarded. Finally, an interesting point that comes across through the trial, especially the High Court, is the emphasis on procedures and court. The simultaneous belief that the person has, dabbled in sedition, but the need to follow procedures remain. So the accused had to be released out of procedural requirements. So, and I think that's just it.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, ma'am.
That was really interesting. And we'll talk more about it in the question answer session. And now finally, we have our last paper that Sabujkoli Mukherjee is going to present. And this is called The Shifting Sands of Citizenship. Okay, so take it away, Sabujkoli.
Yeah, am I audible?
You're very audible.
Oh, okay. I hope the internet connection does not betray me though through the presentation. So I'm going to look at the province of Assam in the aftermath of partition. And so the question of post-colonial belonging in Assam has been imbricated within the extractive logic of the colonial administration as well as the politics of the Pakistan movement. And the existing literature has also talked about how this question flared up in the 1980s with the Assam movement. But what I am going to show is that we also need to look at the moment of partition, how partition played out in this province, because it is very important to know this history. We want to understand the current intractability of the citizenship question in Assam, because the 1951 NRC, for instance, is so ubiquitous now, but it's important to know what were the circumstances in which this document was formulated. And I hope that my presentation gives you all a sense of this contentious history. So I'm going to begin with a very short narrative of the colonial period, because this history is very important to understand what actually happened during partition. So when Assam was formed as a chief commissioner's province in 1874, it was not administratively feasible to govern this province because it had a sparse population. So what the colonial government did, it was they severed Sylhet from Bengal and attached it to Assam. And the Bengali, of course, did not like this. They said that their development was being hampered by being attached to a backward province like Assam. But on the other hand, they were happy to take up the opportunities in the administrative bureaucracy of the colonial government. And over the course of time, the Assamese elite of the Brahmaputra Valley, they resented this competition of the Bengali Hindus. And when the Pakistan movement began in the 1940s, then the Bengali Hindus of Sylhet, they changed course because they now wanted to be included within Assam to avoid the fate of being incorporated within Pakistan. And the Assamese elite, on the other hand, they were okay to let go of Sylhet because they felt that that they would be able to rid their province of Bengalis. But what they did not anticipate at this point was that the Sylheti Bengali Hindus would continue their migration into the province even after partition. And this was one facet of the migration into the province in the colonial period. the second very important thread was the migration of East Bengali peasants into Assam. And this was actually encouraged by the colonial bureaucracy because they wanted more lands under plough, and they felt that this would actually augment the resources of the state. The 1905 partition also increased this migration, and this migration had begun in the last decades of the 19th century, but it now it became a tide through the 20th century, and increasingly land became scarce, and these East Bengali peasants would now encroach on the forest and grazing reserves of the province. And of course, the people did not like this competition. And even the colonial census reports, they painted quite the picture of these peasants who were moving westwards into the Brahmaputra Valley, and they were just occupying the land resources of the province. And the Assamese now feared becoming a minority in their own province. And so economically, the situation was already quite tense. And the Pakistan movement, it aggravated the situation because the Assam Provincial Muslim League, they formed a number of governments in the 1940s, and under Chief Minister Sadullah, and the Provincial Muslim League actually encouraged this migration because it would support their argument that Assam should be incorporated within Pakistan. And the Congress, of course, they opposed this move. And so the situation was already quite tense. And the Assam Congress, they like the Assamese on the question of Bengali Hindus, they managed to escape just with the partition of Sylhet. And the 1947 referendum actually severed major portion of this district, which was now attached to East Pakistan. But again, the movement of Muslim continue even after partition. And so how did partition, how did this drawing unfold in this province, and what can we learn from that history, which can allow us to make sense of the current predicament that we are finding ourselves in? I would look at the influence of this tense situation in Assam, where we see the movement of both Bengali Hindus from Sylhet into Assam, as well as Muslim peasants, the continuing migration of Muslim peasants into Assam. This situation weighed on the minds of the Constituent Assembly members as they debated about the very contentious citizenship provisions of the Constitution. So Article 6 of the Constitution, it says that persons who came before 19th July 1948 would be conferred citizenship, and those who came before that and those who came after that, they would have to prove that they had been residing in India for about 6 months. So the members, some members of the Constituent Assembly were now scared that if persons who had come to India from erstwhile districts of Pakistan before 19th July 1948 were allowed to gain Indian citizenship, then these Muslims who had been migrating before and after the drawing of the Radcliffe Line would be able to claim Indian citizenship. And so Pandit Thakur Das Bhargav, who was a member of the Constituent Assembly from East Punjab, actually moved an amendment to say that that only persons who had come to India on fearing civil disturbances would be allowed to claim Indian citizenship. Now, this amendment is very crucial because it also shows that Bhargav was not aware that partition unfolded in very different ways, both in the east and the west of the subcontinent. While in Punjab, we had this very swift drawing of borders, and there was a massive movement of people. In the east, it was very different because the incidents of violence were more sporadic, and migration also happened in spurts over a long period of time. So, and also it's very interesting to know that in the first wave of migration in the east, we have a majority of well-to-do Hindus who moved into the adjoining regions of West Bengal, Assam, and Tripura. So if Bhargav's amendment that only people who came to India fearing civil differences should be given citizenship, then these Bengali Hindu refugees would not be able to claim citizenship. So Bhargav was actually targeting only Muslims, but ironically, his amendment would also affect these Bengali Hindu refugees, and this was a point which was brought forth in the Constituent Assembly. And we had the government's representative, N. Gopalaswamy Iyengar, who said that let the citizenship rest as it is. And he acknowledged that yes, the circumstances in Assam were quite exceptional, and we would have to frame a law to take care of the situation, and we have and these citizenship provisions were in fact passed in August 1949, and it was Iyengar only who then brought forth the Immigrants Expulsion from Assam Act in February 1950, exceptional measure which was taken by the central government, because this act said that any person residing in Assam, if the central government was just satisfied that his or her presence was detrimental to the interests of the country, could just be expelled from the region. And this act is quite important because this act was passed in 1950, and it was important for the central government to pass this act because, interestingly, the government could not use the provisions of the Foreigners Act 1946, because the Foreigners Act stated that any British subject could not be treated as a foreigner on Indian territory, and this was amended only in 1957 with the Foreigners Amendment Act, when a foreigner came to mean a non-citizen of India. So between 1947 and 1957, British subjects were not foreigners on Indian territory. So these East Pakistanis who were coming into Assam, they were also British subjects because they had been born in undivided India, and they could not be ousted as foreigners. And so the government had to specifically enact and accept a special provision to take care of this situation. And it is interesting because the wording of the act, it just said that the central government should be satisfied. And if you read the debates of the provisional parliament, you would get a very vivid sense that the government was protecting its right to determine who would reside within its borders, because they did not want the judiciary to oust the executive prerogative in this scenario. And so to avoid litigation, it had carefully used the words, the central government is of the opinion, so that it was just this satisfaction of the executive that would allow the deportation of people from the province. And just as I mentioned that in the Constituent Assembly, during the Constituent Assembly debates, when the citizenship provisions were being debated, Pandit Bhargav had moved the amendment, although it was not accepted at the end. that persons who had only moved into India on account of civil disturbances should be allowed to gain citizenship. Interestingly, when this bill was being debated in the provisional parliament, people, especially the non-Assamese members of the provisional parliament, they wanted a clear distinction between a Hindu refugee and a Muslim immigrant. And they categorically stated that Hindu refugees should be left outside the purview of this bill, so that the Assamese government cannot act against them. And in fact, the emotions were so high in the provisional parliament in 1950 that the government had to accept this, and this bill was amended to include the proviso that any person who had moved on account of civil disturbances would not be brought within the purview of this bill. So we see how religion was playing a very dominant role in both the Constituent Assembly and the Provisional Parliament to determine the contours of post-colonial belonging. And even in the Provisional Parliament, the members, they were constantly saying that Bengali Hindu refugees, they are our brothers, but their target was constantly the Muslim immigrant. And we have this figure of the 5 lakhs of Muslim immigrants have come into the province, and then they demanded that a census count should be taken to determine the exact number of Muslims in the province. And it was in this context that we have the 1951 census count in Assam. And the 1951 NRC, which was a secret administrative document, was actually based on these census slips of 1951. And the census superintendent of Assam was this person, R.B. Wagaiwala. And if we read the census report of 1951, it's actually a lesson in how even documents can, if we read them against the grain, then how it's also possible to cull the individual anguish from government documents, from archival sources. Because Wagaiwala, of course, he was a census superintendent, and he maintained that, yes, my document is scientifically, it's verifiable, but we need to look beyond these abstract figures, because even Wagaiwala had to concede that there was under enumeration in the census report, and almost 68,000 people had been under enumerated in the 1951 census. And the 1951 NRC was based on the this census report itself. And it's also very interesting because 1950 also saw communal incidences against Muslims. So many Muslims, especially from the border districts, had been temporarily dislocated, and they could not return before the census count was taken in March 1951. So even
we have to ramp up in 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yes. Yeah, 2 minutes.
And so so even these Muslims, they were it was quite possible that the census report did not take into account their presence, and this 1951 NRC was based on this census report, and these figures of the 1951 NRC would assume a vicious significance within a decade, because there was a massive deportation program in the 1960s, which was based on this 1951 NRC document, which now came into the hands of the Assam Police Department. And I'll quickly wrap up, and I'll try to give you the significance of the 1951 NRC in our contemporary debates about citizenship in Assam, and then we can just talk about that during the Q&A session. Even the Assam movement, for instance, they constantly stressed that 1951 NRC should be updated. And this was a constant refrain. And finally, and this history I'm sure everyone is aware of, it was undertaken as a massive bureaucratic exercise in 2013 under the supervision of the Supreme Court of India, and this document was finally published in 2019, and this time the person who was responsible for the supervision was Pratik Hajela, and almost 19 lakh people have been left outside of its purview, including a lot of Hindus. And ironically, again, the Hindu majoritarian rhetoric and the regional concern about the presence of foreigners have intersected in very interesting ways to influence the question of citizenship in Assam. And I think that my paper has been based mostly on debates in the parliament, in constituent assembly, in the Assam Legislative Assembly, and census reports. But I would like to end with a poem, because there is a very vibrant genre of Mia activist poetry which has emerged in the context of Assam. And this poem is by Hafiz Ahmed. Write down, I am a Mia. My serial number in the NRC is 200543. I have 2 children. Another is coming next summer. Will you hate him as you hate me? And I think I'm ending with this because poetry gives us a very vivid sense of the individual anguish which connects the 1951 NRC with the 2019 NRC. And I think, like poetry, to give us a sense of the anguish of these individuals, even if it's based on a reading of debates within elite forums. And I would love to have your feedback, because it's a very contemporary concern. So I'm sure many people are aware of this history, and I'm sure that in my own little way, you get a sense of how it played out in the 1950s when we had the 1947 partition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sapuchkoli. That was really interesting. Are there any questions from anyone, or should I start, or how should we do this?
I think you could start if there aren't any questions from the audience as of now.
Okay. So I'm just going to start with the first two papers, which were on famine by Lalit and Bobby. And so I have some general questions. So one of the things that this Research Students Conference is meant to do, Lalit and Bobby, is to actually showcase some original research, right? And both of you have sort of what you've emphasized is the kind of historiographical work on famine and famine policy in India, right? Now, and many of these debates are very old. So for instance, this Michelle McAlpin, Lalit, that you're talking about was writing in the 1980s, and there's been a lot of work since then. I mean, I'm not familiar with all of. Firstly, why it is that you think that this is an important point to make today, or what is the relevance of these historiographical debates in your work and in the conversation on famines today? And the second thing is, just what are your own insights into this? Because I want to know about what trying to do this to these debates, right? So it's as simple as that, right? This conference is meant for us to know about your research. So tell us about your research. Okay. Now, again, while I'm not an expert on famines, I know, for instance, that Roy has, and you mentioned him, has said, look, let's think about this question of man-made famines versus ecological famines or is our famines man-made or ecological in a more sort of complicated way. And what he would argue is that, look, obviously, if you stress ecology and if you stress this question of climate and droughts, etc., there is a way in which you're underplaying state policy. But on the other hand, looking at state policy alone makes the whole question entirely ideological, and it doesn't explain why under late colonialism you have fewer famines. So I wondered what you would say about that. And he actually talks about this question of knowledge, right? That there is, in the late colonial period, the growth of different kinds of scientific bodies of knowledge that allow one to cope with the question of famine, right? So meteorological information, climate information, all kinds, which economic statistical information, which allows the state actually to manage famine in better, right? So this is not to downplay ideology or to dismiss ecology, but it is basically to think about the state in a more complicated way, right? And for instance, one very interesting point he makes is, what does colonialism do to private relief efforts, to private philanthropic efforts to combat famine, etc. So how does one think about it? Not, I mean, because it seems like a very basically an old and overdetermined debate to say, is it ecology, is it man-made? So are there other ways in which we can think about the issue today, right? Because and has your material, has your archive allowed you to sort of think about this debate in a more complicated way, right? All of that to say, I want to hear more about you, about your research. Let's go on to Annie's paper. And Annie, thank you. That was really interesting. And now there are several things that I was interested in. The first is, as you say, the sedition we usually understand through these big debates, right? Through Tilak, Gandhi, etc. And you're thinking about this proliferation of sort of local, of smaller sedition cases, right? Now, how does that help us? How does that allow us to nuance this, the material, our understanding of how law penetrates society, how people are influenced by the law? And I was particularly, and by how are they shaped by colonialism, by what kind of legal subjects are there? And I was particularly interested in this question of how the Suresh Sanyal's articles actually, what it does is to not just what it does is to merely talk about, it's not just about the colonial state versus the enslaved Indians. It also makes traitors of particular communities of Indians, right? So if you don't stand up against the state, then you're a traitor. I mean, other than the communal angle, which is there very strongly. So there are different ways in which the idea of sedition has been sort of absorbed, and how the law allows, is sort of understood and negotiated to produce these sorts of ideas, right? So and one of the things that I was thinking about is, what is really interesting is, and I think that makes, is that I mean, and I don't know about, unlike these big trials, here the sedition itself is not something that is that seems to be disputed by the defense, right? It's basically that you get off on a technicality, right? So that makes it so, whereas, for instance, you know, the question in so say Tilak or Gandhi, the question of, you know, being seditious itself is a nationalist statement, right? Here, what you have is the fact that and finally Suresh Sanyal gets off on a technicality because his handwriting, the recognition is a problem, etc. And I wondered whether you could talk more about that, but also what is the, you know, how public is this trial, right? We talked about how the big trials are also big public spectacles. How public is this trial? How is it picked up by the local press? How are people talking about it? Because I mean, what you're really interested in is how these how the law sort of penetrates the sort of the imagination of the colonized, how colonial law, and how is this trial, how is it a part of the public imagination, right? How does it out from the formal realms of the law, the courts, etc.? Are the newspapers talking about it? Do we have other kinds of forums where it becomes a part of public conversation? So that's one, that's to begin with. And finally, Sabuj Koli, thank you so much for this very interesting paper. Now, I just have a few sort of small points to make and questions to ask. You know, one is you seem to imply that this kind of this history of this partition is missing from conversations about citizenship in Assam. And why is it for us to know this history? And that's what's from. How does it nuance the present day debates about citizenship, whether academic or political, and why is it important? That's one question that I wanted to ask. The second thing is, which is, I was just interested about, and you go through these different legislative moments when you have the passing of different kinds of laws, etc. And I was interested in this. It's all fascinating, but the Immigrant Expulsion Act, the 1950s, where you seem to imply that there is a certain kind of, there's a way in which the executive wants to sort of assert its superiority over the judiciary. And I wondered whether you could say more about that, and whether there are actually cases which come before the courts, right? Whether this is fait accompli, or whether there are ways in which there are controversial cases, or cases which require sort of the intervention of the courts. So that was one thing that I wanted to ask you about. And finally, you know, and I know that this is the way in which your work is moving, which is why I'm asking you this final question, which is that, you know, you talked about how, and it's interesting to me that you ended with this Mia poetry, and you talk about how even census reports are capable of yielding, you know, this kind of anguish if read against the grain, etc. What are the other ways in which we perhaps access these experiences? Are there other kinds of sources for the historian, other kinds of archives that we can so what we see through these moves, by different kinds of moves by the state, is that the understanding of who an immigrant is and who a refugee is, who a Indian is, etc., is the religion question is very important. I mean, it would also be interesting to see how this question of the indigenous resident, how does that sort of come into these debates? But I wondered, you know, because you end with poetry, are these the kinds of archives that we have to look for, or is it sort of the margins of the official archive that we find this anguish? You know, if you feel that, okay, it's important to talk about this question of citizenship in different registers, where do we access these registers, right? So I'll leave it at that and then let you guys.
Thank you so
much. Anyone wants? Shall we go in the other direction and start with Sabuj Koli?
Yeah, I'm willing to go ahead.
Okay, go on.
Yeah, so the first question where you said that what, like where you asked what is the significance of the moment of partition for a contemporary understanding of post-colonial belonging in the province. So the literature on this question, especially in the context of Assam, it has mostly focused on the colonial history and the flare up of this issue in the 1980s. But what I am trying to show is that this moment, the long partition is very important, and it's important to see how it unfolded in Assam, because for instance, if you read about the 2019 NRC, then you will have constant references to the 1951 NRC. What were actually the circumstances with this document was framed, and in fact this 1951 NRC, it's actually one of the key documents in the legacy data, which allows for inclusion in the 2019 NRC,
Right.
Along with other documents like pre 1971 electoral rolls or land documents, and important to make sense of the current intractability of the question. I feel that both it's important to understand how this question is imbricated within the longer colonial history, and also to see how the post-colonial moment actually continues to cast its long shadow on this issue, because that might better help us negotiate with this question, because I hope, like, my paper, it gave a sense of how, like, citizenship in Assam, it's act like a complex Venn diagram, because we have
Absolutely, yeah.
we have the empire as well, because these people, like, at least in 1957 they were British subjects, so they were they could not be deported as foreigners. Then we have the question of Bengali Hindu refugees from Sylhet, and then we have these Muslim peasants as well. So we this and it's important to study or even just try to unentangle these complex threads, because that allows for a better understanding of the situation that we have before us right now, where like almost 19 lakh people have found themselves outside of this document, and they face a very bleak future of possible incarceration in detention centers, and trials before shoddy foreigner tribunals. So I feel that this it's important to write this history, and I hope it, like, would you have some contribution to this answer, or should I go ahead with the next question?
No, please go on to the next question.
Okay.
Because everybody else also has to speak.
Okay.
We can talk later, no problem.
Yeah. And the second question was, you were interested in the immigrants' expulsion.
Yeah.
So this act was passed in February 1950.
Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely fascinating that you point to this, and very important that you point to how this act allowed for the executive to take precedence over the judiciary. And in fact, as you point out, this was a very very important concern during when the citizenship provisions were being enacted, and as well as when the Citizenship Act was framed in 1955. We are constantly seeing this dilemma between the executive and the judiciary, and and who should actually be given the responsibility for the safeguard of constitutional rights. And this constant dilemma between rights and national security, and Assam, because now it's really a bordering region, and it shares its borders with China, with Burma, and with Pakistan. The central government is paranoid that it needs to have the power to determine this question in Assam, and therefore. And in fact, Iyengar mentions in the parliament that the law ministry had categorically given its advice that the law should be framed in such a manner, and the wording should be the central government should be of the opinion. So it was, and one of the members, and it was so vague that it would allow for complete executive power over the question of membership. And in fact, I did a search also on indianqanun.org, and there were no cases with regard to Immigrants Expulsion Act. But interestingly, this question was again, this executive judiciary binary was again, this concern was overwhelming. Even 5 years later, when the citizenship bill was being debated in the parliament, and there were members who stated that, look, the executive cannot be given the sole responsibility of determining such an important question. And but actually, an extensive case record under the Citizenship Act, because so many individuals, they went to court challenging the executive's power. I'm running short on time, right? I mean,
you can take a few more minutes.
Go on? Does that satisfy your question?
Yes. We can also talk more later, but yes,
yeah, because this aspect is absolutely fabulous, and because there's so much material on this executive judiciary, because this was a concern which was as they debated these bills in the aftermath of the creation of post-colonial state. And the third question, again, I feel it's very interesting for me, because I think, like, at this current stage, I'm trying to negotiate how to balance our overwhelming concern with the official archive, with actually dealing with sources which are more eclectic in nature, and which, quote unquote, do not fit the criteria of the traditional archive. And that's why I also ended with poetry. Yeah.
Pushpalini, I'm so sorry. You have to wrap up quickly, because apparently we have only 15 minutes more, and I have to give the other three also a chance.
Okay,
yes, quickly. So no, I'll just quickly say that I think that it's very important to bring in different kinds of sources in our construction of the narrative, from fiction to poetry to even films, because it's only an eclectic archive which can actually allow us to tell better narratives, where we give a better sense of individuals dealt with the violence of partition, with state formation. And also, I think that will also allow us to deconstruct the idea of the state apparatus itself.
Thank you. Yes, we'll talk more later.
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry, Lalit, you wanted to come in?
Okay. Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay. So, ma'am, you are right that it's very old debate. But actually, I'm doing my PhD in labor relation, or broadly economic relations. Okay, so one chapter is on famine, or just dealing 19th century or early decades of 20th century. Okay, so I read many books, okay, on famine, okay, or theme related famine. So one major book was McAlpin, okay, that deals with that stand. Okay, so McAlpin, Tirthankar Roy just wrote some one or two articles, not a systematic book on that famine issue, but I found that they present a uh, very positive picture, okay, of that
Of the
period.
colonial state.
Yes, of the colonial state. Very positive picture. Okay, so there is one
So
book
what
by.
does, let me interrupt you, Lalit. Tell me about your
Okay, ma'am.
own research. How does it sort of contradict this positive picture? Tell us about what you have seen in your sources.
Okay, so ma'am, okay, I found that since the very beginning of the 19th century, when they started land revenue policy, okay, so simultaneous the
Where?
in
What's your area?
okay, in northwestern provinces, and
Okay.
specifically Agra division. Okay, so at that time conquered and ceded provinces.
Okay.
Okay, so in that area, the whole process of pauperization also just started. Okay, and many works also deal that S.C. Sharma, S.C. Gupta or Asiya Siddiqui. Okay, so there both of these deals in the early decades of 19th century. In the later half of 19th century and early decades of 20th century, the process continues. Okay, so the process means that the process of pauperization, the people being just dispossessed what they actually have, and they were not just laborers or some low caste people. No, many jamidars also just went through the same process. Okay, so yes, so that picture actually contradict with the picture they presented. Okay, so one scholar by Chernyak, so who wrote a book in 1962, so who traced the same sort of trend, okay, at the international level, and he argued that they are new colonialists. They are defending colonialism by overemphasizing some other aspects. So in that way, yeah, in that way, I'm trying to say in this paper.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Annie, do you want to say something? We have not that we have some time, and then we can Bobby finally.
Yes, ma'am. So you said that, you know, unlike big trials, the sedition in this case is not disputed. So this case is happening in 1912, right? And we do, as in, I've read Sukeshi Kamla's work, and she argues that before this period, 1907, before 1905, before that, you know, loyalty was an idea which was instrumentalized to argue that, I'm not against the government, I'm not against, the colonial state, I have been loyal, I've protected these many peoples in the past. However, here we are saying that, that there is a shift. In 1912, there is some shift in the way the defense is arguing its case. They're saying that, that of course, we are critiquing the leaflet does critique, at least till the lower court. It's saying that the leaflet does critique certain people, it critiques the missionaries, right? It critiques certain bureaucracy. And this is a thing that we do see in Tilak's trial as well.
Okay,
right? Tilak also argues that, the translation is problematic, or that the critique is not pointed towards the government, it's pointed towards the bureaucracy. It's only later, with Gandhi that it becomes something of an open defiance.
I see.
So this case, I think, is developing in 1912, and so here I do see a shift in the sense that loyalty is not instrumentalized at all. They're saying that, yeah, we are upset with certain aspects, we are upset with these aspects. How is it part of the public conversation? I feel, I have to, this is the beginning of my research, I need to explore, articles, but I feel, the fact that Jugantar and Hitabdi newspaper were already under, government checked. And so if we see the case, right, in light of the cases that had been filed against Jugantar and Hitabdi newspaper, then they are telling, right, that people were that the colonial state was surveilling Jugantar and in turn accusing people of sedition who had been, reading or engaging with these textual traditions, these texts. So this is what I want to say.
Okay, thank you. Bobby? Bobby, are you here?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Bobby, do you have anything to say? And there are also some audience questions. So, Bobby, do you want to respond to any of my comments? Do you want to tell us about your own research a little bit?
My research in famines and agrarian labor, famines and labor relation in North Colonial India, Agra division. 1850 से 1900.
हाँ, ठीक है. तो उसके बारे में क्या कहना है आपको?
जी मैम, मेरा जो रिसर्च का जो कंसेप्चुलाइजेशन है रिसर्च का, एक द ओरिजिन ऑफ प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी के बाद फॉर्मेशन ऑफ क्लास स्ट्रक्चर, लैंड ओनर कम्युनिटी और प्लस लैंड और इसका जो अपोजिट इंटरेस्ट और लैंडलेस कम्युनिटी. उसके बाद फेमिन्स को जोड़ना कि कैसे फेमिन्स को डेमोग्राफिकल होता है, बट इसका जो इफेक्ट होता है वो पार्टिकुलर एक सेक्शन पे क्यों पड़ता है, इस वजह से हम इसे डेमोग्राफिकल नहीं बोल सकते.
ठीक है.
हाँ, तो उसमें लैंडलेस जो लेबर है, एग्रीरियन लेबर है, जुलाहे हैं, वो ज्यादा प्रभावित होते हैं.
You've started looking at your sources, Bobby?
हाँ मैम.
You've started your field work?
अभी नहीं मैम, अब करूँगा.
अच्छा, अभी तक शुरू नहीं हुआ है फील्ड वर्क?
हाँ नहीं मैम, फील्ड वर्क शुरू नहीं हुआ है, थोड़ा प्राइमरी सोर्स वगैरह डील किए हैं, कुछ. अच्छा, फील्ड वर्क अभी नहीं किया.
ठीक है, ओके. Moksha, you wanted to ask some audience questions?
Yes, if there are questions from the audience, we could maybe take them.
Okay.
Are
there any questions from the audience? Will they put them in the box or?
If anyone has any question or observation, they can just unmute themselves or they can raise their hands.
Okay. Yes, Lalit.
मैम, बॉबी के लिए, बॉबी और मैं मैम भाई है, वो छोटा भाई है मेरा.
अच्छा.
सो हम एक ही एरिया पे कर रहे हैं ब्रॉडली. सो बॉबी, तुमने कहा कि एक सेक्शन पे पढ़ता है, तो एक सेक्शन वाली बात तो ठीक है कि जो छोटे किसान हैं और जो भूमिहीन हैं उनके ऊपर पड़ता है, लेकिन वो एक जाति तक नहीं होता है. उसमें जो मेजॉरिटी है वो किसी एक जाति तक नहीं है. उसमें अगर कास्ट वाइज देखो तो SC, ST और OBC ग्रुप्स भी, ठीक है. इसके अलावा कुछ क्या है, अपर कास्ट भी, जो सो कॉल्ड अपर कास्ट और सो कॉल्ड जो भी कास्ट का ग्रुप्स है, जहाँ भी ग्रेडेशन है, वो मिलते हैं, बट ये प्रोपोर्शन में अंतर हो सकता है, बट वो किसी भी हाल में सिर्फ एक जाति तक सीमित नहीं होते, ठीक है, मेजॉरिटी मिल सकती है। ओके
भैया
Bobby, you want to respond to that?
हाँ, मेरा ये था भैया, कैसे ज्यादातर प्राइमरी सोर्स में भी देखा गया कि ज्यादातर लैंड ओनर्स जो कम्युनिटी थी वो उनमें से ज्यादातर अपर कास्ट के थे, और जो लैंडलेस थी, जो प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी के बाद परमानेंट सेटलमेंट के बाद और ये रैयतवाड़ी सिस्टम के बाद एक कम्युनिटी लैंडलेस हो गई थी, तो इस आधार पे।
ओके सो ये जो किताब है कंसीडरिंग अनटचेबिलिटी, सो रिकंसिडरिंग अनटचेबिलिटी का जो खास आर्गुमेंट है वो यही है कि जो ये अनटचेबल मतलब चमार जो है वो एग्रीकल्चरलिस्ट थे, तो इसका मतलब ये हुआ कि वो उनके पास भूमि थी, ठीक है। इस आर्गुमेंट की अपनी प्रॉब्लम्स हो सकती है, बट तुम एस.सी. गुप्ता का और आसिया सिद्दीकी का रिसर्च पढ़ो जो अर्ली 19th सेंचुरी को डील करता है, जब एकदम ज्यादा सिस्टमेटाइजेशन नहीं है, लैंड सेटलमेंट शुरू हो रहा है एकदम, तो उनमें वो दिखाती हैं, और बाद के काम में भी, कि किस तरह से बड़े बड़े जमींदार भी डिस्प्लेस्ड हो रहे थे और उनकी जमीनें जो एक नया उभरने वाला वर्ग है, ट्रेडिंग क्लास, मतलब जो जिसकी ब्याज और व्यापार इन सब से खास ताल्लुक था, वो खरीद रहा था। तो इसमें जो डिस्पोजिशन है प्रोसेस, वो सिर्फ लोअर कास्ट ग्रुप तक सीमित नहीं रही, वो अपर कास्ट में भी थी, बट डिग्री का अंतर हो सकता है।
So Bobby, you're very lucky you have someone in the family to guide you, as well as government. I think we can, Moksh, I think we can wrap up now. And so thank you all four of you, and Moksh and Soumya, for this session. And and best of luck for the rest of the conference. Okay, is there anything else, Moksh?
Thank you, ma'am. Just that we'll reconvene at 2 o'clock for a session on regional culture and politics in modern India. Early modern India, I'm very sorry. So thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Time do we reassemble?
So at 2 p.m.
2.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Amar, you're here. Hi.
I have been here throughout.
Okay, all right, bye.
Yeah. I enjoyed all the presentations, Lalit, Bobby, Aini.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.